844 people perished in 20 feet of water. Not in the open ocean, not in a storm, in a river, the Chicago River, on a calm Saturday morning in July. The ship was still tied to the dock when it happened. The sidewalk was 6 feet away. Some of the passengers could have reached out and touched dry land. They did not get the chance. This is the deadliest single-vessel disaster in Great Lakes history. More lives lost in a single morning than the Titanic claimed per hour of its sinking. The Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes to go down. The Eastland took less than 5. And if Blackwell were to stop 100 people on Michigan Avenue today and ask what happened at the Clark Street dock on July 24, 1915, not one of them would know. There is a reason for that. The reason is not the passage of time. The reason is not irrelevance. The reason is that this disaster was caused, in part, by a safety law. And nobody, not the... Someone warned them. They did not listen. People perished. A commission was formed, and then the next ship set sail. The Eastland. She was built in 1903 by the Jenks Shipbuilding Company in Port Huron, Michigan. 265 feet long, 36 feet wide, steel hull. Designed for the Lake Michigan passenger trade, ferrying day trippers and excursion groups between Chicago and the resort towns on the lake's eastern shore. A pleasure steamer, a summer ship, the kind of vessel that families boarded with picnic baskets and children in Sunday clothes, and no thought at all about whether the ship beneath their feet could hold them safely. She was, by the standards of her time, a handsome vessel. 3 enclosed passenger decks, a promenade deck on top, capacity for 2,500 passengers, twin screws, a top speed of roughly 16 knots. She looked, from the dock, like a perfectly ordinary Great Lakes steamer. She was not ordinary. She had a flaw. The flaw was built into her from the beginning, woven into the very geometry of her hull and superstructure, and it would define every day of her 12-year career as a passenger ship. The Eastland was top-heavy. Her hull was narrow, 36 feet across, but her superstructure, the enclosed decks above the waterline, was wide and tall. This meant that her center of gravity, the point around which the entire ship's weight is balanced, was dangerously high. In naval architecture, the measurement that determines how well a ship rights itself after tilting is called the metacentric height. A ship with a high metacentric height snaps back upright quickly when pushed to one side. A ship with a low metacentric height rolls slowly, reluctantly, and if pushed far enough, does not come back at all. The Eastland had a low metacentric height, dangerously low. This was not a matter of opinion, it was a matter of physics. A man named George Hilton, who would later spend decades assembling the definitive account of the disaster, described the Eastland's design as inherently compromised. The hull was too narrow for the superstructure it carried. The passenger decks were too tall, too wide, too heavy relative to the body of water they displaced below the waterline. The ship had been built to maximize revenue. 2,500 passengers meant 2,500 fares, and 2,500 fares required 2,500 bodies' worth of enclosed deck space above the waterline. The math was simple, the physics was not. Profit above physics. Blackwell encounters this equation so often that it barely registers as unusual anymore. It is the default setting of industrial history. The variable changes. Sometimes it is passengers, sometimes it is coal miners, sometimes it is garment workers, but the equation is always the same. Maximize capacity, minimize cost. Hope the physics holds. The physics did not hold. The first warning came in 1904, 1 year after the Eastland was launched. During a routine passenger loading at a Chicago dock, the ship listed so severely to one side that water poured through her gangports. The small openings in the hull near the waterline used for ventilation and cargo access. The passengers, feeling the deck tilt beneath them, scrambled to the opposite side. The crew flooded the ballast tanks on the low side to counteract the lean. Ballast tanks are compartments in the bottom of the hull that can be filled with water to add weight where it is needed, lowering the center of gravity and stabilizing the vessel. It worked. The ship righted. The passengers disembarked. No one was hurt. No incident report was filed with the United States Steamboat Inspection Service, the federal agency responsible for certifying the safety of passenger vessels on American waterways. The season continued. Let Blackwell pause here for a moment and explain the Steamboat Inspection Service, because this agency will appear repeatedly in this story, and its role is central to everything that follows. The Steamboat Inspection Service was established in 1852 after a series of catastrophic boiler explosions on Mississippi River steamboats. Its mandate was straightforward: inspect passenger vessels, certify their safety, set capacity limits, and revoke the licenses of ships that failed to meet standards. It was, in theory, the federal government's guarantee that a passenger boarding a ship in an American port could trust that the vessel beneath them had been examined by qualified inspectors and found to be sound. In practice, the service was underfunded, understaffed, and subject to the same pressures that afflict every regulatory body tasked with overseeing the industry that pays its inspectors' salaries. The inspectors were not corrupt in the dramatic sense. They did not take envelopes of cash. They were simply part of a system in which approving a vessel was the path of least resistance, and rejecting one created paperwork, conflict, and the possibility of being overruled by a superior who did not want to antagonize the shipping companies. The incentive structure pointed in one direction: approve, certify, move on. This is the machinery that certified the Eastland every year from 1903 to 1915. 12 consecutive years, 12 inspections, 12 stamps of approval, despite everything that follows. In 1904, a naval architect named John Devereux York inspected the Eastland independently. York was not affiliated with the Steamboat Inspection Service. He was a private engineer hired, depending on the source, either by a concerned investor or by a competing steamship company seeking to discredit the Eastland's operators. His motivations may have been mixed. His findings were not. York measured the Eastland's metacentric height and found it to be below what he considered the minimum safe margin for a passenger vessel of her size and configuration. He wrote a letter to the Steamboat Inspection Service stating his conclusions in direct, technical language. The vessel was unstable. Her capacity should be reduced. Additional ballast should be permanently installed to lower her center of gravity. Failure to take these steps, York wrote, risked a catastrophic capsizing under loaded conditions. The Steamboat Inspection Service received the letter. There is a record of its receipt. There is no record of any action taken in response. York's letter went into a file. The file went into a cabinet. The Eastland went back into service. In 1906, the ship was operating under a new chief engineer named Charles Eccliffe. Eccliffe was a competent marine engineer who quickly recognized the same problem York had identified 2 years earlier. The ship was unstable. She listed unpredictably during passenger loading. The ballast system, while functional, was a patch on a structural deficiency. Eccliffe began keeping his own records of the ship's behavior, noting dates and conditions when the Eastland listed beyond what he considered safe parameters. On at least one occasion in 1906, the ship was carrying a full load of approximately 2,500 passengers on a Lake Michigan excursion when she rolled hard to port. Eccliffe later testified that the lean was severe enough that from his position in the engine room, looking through a porthole on the low side, he could see the bottom of the river. The ballast system corrected the lean. The trip continued. The passengers, most of whom were on the upper decks enjoying the view, were unaware of how close they had come to the water. Eccliffe reported his concerns to the ship's owners. He told them the vessel was dangerous at full capacity. He recommended either reducing the passenger limit or adding permanent ballast to the hull. The owners did neither. Eccliffe was not fired. He was simply not listened to. There is a difference, but the outcome is the same. In 1908, the Eastland was sold to new owners, the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, headed by a man named William Hull. Hull's company made modifications to the vessel. They enclosed portions of the upper deck that had previously been open to the weather, installing walls and a roof to create a covered promenade space. This made the ship more comfortable for passengers. It also added significant weight to the superstructure, raising the center of gravity even further. The modifications required inspection and approval by the Steamboat Inspection Service. The service inspected the vessel, found her acceptable, and reissued her certificate of operation. The passenger capacity remained at 2,500. Blackwell has read the inspection report from 1908. It is brief. It notes the modifications. It does not mention stability calculations. It does not reference York's letter from 1904. It does not reference Eccliffe's concerns from 1906. Each inspection, it appears, began from scratch, as if the ship had no history, no institutional memory, no file that an inspector might pull before climbing aboard and running through his checklist. In 1912, the general manager of the company operating the Eastland, a man named Walter Steele, took an unusual step. He wrote a letter directly to the Steamboat Inspection Service expressing his concern about the vessel's stability. Steele was not an engineer, he was a business manager, but he had been on the ship enough times to notice that she handled differently than other vessels in the fleet. She was sluggish to right herself. She leaned when she should not have leaned. Something was wrong, and Steele, to his credit, put his concern in writing and sent it to the agency whose job it was to address exactly this kind of concern. The service replied. Their reply stated that the Eastland had been inspected and was within acceptable parameters. No additional review would be conducted. Steele kept a copy of his letter and a copy of the reply. Both documents would surface later, in testimony, in court filings, in the long and ultimately futile effort to hold someone accountable for what happened 3 years after Steele mailed his warning. 4 warnings. 4 separate individuals across 11 years. Identified the same problem. John Devereux York, 1904, naval architect, wrote a technical assessment, filed with the Steamboat Inspection Service. Charles Eccliffe, 1906, chief engineer, reported instability to the owners, kept personal records. The 1908 inspectors could have caught the issue during the modification review. They did not. Walter Steele, 1912, general manager, wrote directly to the federal agency, received a form reply, 4 warnings, not vague concerns, not hunches, specific documented observations about a specific measurable problem on a specific vessel, filed with the specific agency responsible for preventing the specific outcome that would occur on July 24, 1915. The agency received every one. The agency acted on none. Now, Blackwell must cross the Atlantic for a moment, because the next chapter of this story begins not in Chicago, but in the North Atlantic. On a night in April 1912, 1,500 miles from the nearest shore. The sinking of the RMS Titanic does not need a detailed retelling here. The facts are known. An ocean liner strikes an iceberg. The hull is breached. The ship goes down in 2 hours and 40 minutes. 1,503 people perish. The water temperature is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. There are not enough lifeboats. That last fact, the lifeboats, is the one that matters for this story. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats. Their combined capacity was approximately 1,178 people. The ship was carrying 2,208. More than 1,000 people had no lifeboat seat. Many of the lifeboats that were launched were not full. Some left the ship carrying fewer than 30 people in a boat designed for 65. The reasons for this are complex. Panic, confusion, crew inexperience with the davit mechanisms, the persistent belief among some passengers that the ship could not actually sink and that boarding a lifeboat was an unnecessary precaution. But the public did not care about complexity. The public cared about the arithmetic. Not enough lifeboats. More than 1,000 dead because there were not enough lifeboats. The equation was simple and devastating, and it produced an immediate, overwhelming demand for legislative action. In the United States, the response came from Senator Robert Marion Follette of Wisconsin. Follette was a progressive reformer who had been pushing a comprehensive maritime safety bill for years, long before the Titanic. The bill addressed multiple issues: working conditions for seamen, minimum crew sizes, safety equipment requirements. It had been stalled in Congress, opposed by shipping interests who argued it would increase operating costs and reduce American competitiveness on international routes. The Titanic changed the calculus. Overnight, opposition to maritime safety legislation became politically untenable. The imagery was too powerful. Half-empty lifeboats rowing away from a sinking ship while 1,000 people thrashed in freezing water. Any senator who voted against lifeboat requirements would be voting, in the public mind, for more Titanics. The bill moved. It took 3 more years of negotiation and amendment, but on March 4, 1915, President Woodrow Wilson signed the Follette Seamen's Act into law. Among its many provisions, the Act required that all passenger vessels operating in American waters carry sufficient lifeboats, life rafts, and life preservers for every person on board. Not some, not a percentage, every person. The intention was unambiguous. No more arithmetic nightmares. No more half-empty lifeboats while passengers drowned. Every ship would carry enough life-saving equipment for a complete evacuation, and the Titanic disaster would never be repeated. Blackwell has no quarrel with the intention. The Titanic's lifeboat shortage was a genuine failure of regulation and corporate negligence. The Follette Act addressed a real problem. The question is not whether the law was well-intentioned. The question is whether anyone considered what the law would do to a specific kind of ship that was nothing like the Titanic. The Titanic was 882 feet long. The Eastland was 265. The Titanic displaced 52,000 tons. The Eastland displaced approximately 2,000. The Titanic crossed the open Atlantic. The Eastland crossed the Chicago River. The Titanic's passengers might wait hours for rescue in freezing water far from shore. The Eastland's passengers were, at most, 100 feet from a dock in a river shallow enough to stand in. The life-saving equipment requirements made sense for the Titanic. They made sense for any large ocean-going vessel operating far from land in deep, cold water, where the interval between disaster and rescue could be measured in hours or days. But the Follette Act did not distinguish between ocean liners and river steamers. It applied to all passenger vessels. A blanket requirement. One size fits all. The Eastland's operators received notice in the spring of 1915 that the vessel must comply with the new federal regulations. Additional lifeboats and life rafts had to be installed before the summer excursion season began. The equipment was procured and mounted. Life rafts were lashed to the roof of the upper superstructure. Additional davits, the crane-like mechanisms used to lower lifeboats, were fitted along the boat deck. New lifeboats were hoisted into position. Every item was placed above the waterline. Every item added weight to the top of the ship. The life rafts on the roof of the superstructure, the davits bolted to the boat deck railings, the lifeboats hanging from the davits, all of it above the center of gravity, all of it pushing the center of gravity higher. A naval architect named Herbert Sadler would later calculate that the additional life-saving equipment added approximately 14 tons to the Eastland's upper works. 14 tons does not sound like much for a ship displacing 2,000, but placement matters more than weight. 14 tons at the waterline is manageable. 14 tons, 30 feet above the waterline, on a ship that was already top-heavy, is the difference between a vessel that leans and recovers and a vessel that leans and does not come back. Nobody performed this calculation before the equipment was installed. Nobody asked whether the Eastland, specifically, could handle the additional topside weight. The law said, carry the lifeboats. The law did not say, check whether the ship can survive carrying them. Blackwell wants to be precise here, because precision matters when 844 people are dead. The additional life-saving equipment was not the sole cause of the Eastland disaster. The ship was dangerous before the Follette Act. She had been dangerous since the day she was launched in 1903. Her narrow hull, her tall superstructure, her low metacentric height, these were original defects present from the first voyage. The 11 years of warnings, the ignored letters, the rubber stamp inspections, all of this predated the new law. But the law added the final weight. It was the last variable inserted into an equation that had been trending toward catastrophe for over a decade. The Eastland was a ship balanced on a knife's edge, and the Follette Act pushed her over. Not alone, not without help from every inspector, every owner, every regulator who had looked at this ship and decided she was fine. But the law was the last hand on her shoulder. The lifeboats designed to prevent the next Titanic helped cause the next disaster. The irony is not subtle. It is the kind of irony that Blackwell finds in archives with nauseating frequency. A solution that creates the exact problem it was meant to solve, because nobody asked whether the solution fit the specific case. July 24, 1915, a Saturday, Chicago, Illinois. The weather is overcast with intermittent light rain. The temperature is in the low 70s. The Chicago River is calm, its surface barely moving, its water brown and opaque with the usual mixture of industrial runoff and silt. The Western Electric Company, one of the largest employers in Chicago, has organized its annual summer picnic for employees and their families. The destination is Michigan City, Indiana, roughly 60 miles southeast across Lake Michigan. 5 chartered steamships are waiting at the Clark Street dock on the south bank of the Chicago River to transport the excursion group. The Eastland is berthed first, closest to the street. The picnic is an enormous event. Western Electric employs tens of thousands of workers at its Hawthorne Works factory in Cicero, a suburb west of Chicago. The factory produces telephone equipment for the Bell system. The workers are predominantly immigrants, Czech, Polish, Norwegian, German, Irish, first and second generation, many of them young, many with families. The annual picnic is the social event of the year. Families who cannot afford vacations look forward to this one day of recreation for months. The mood in the early morning hours is festive, eager, excited. Workers and their families begin arriving at the Clark Street dock before 6 in the morning. They come by streetcar, by foot, by bicycle. They carry picnic hampers and parasols and blankets. Women wear summer dresses and wide-brimmed hats. Children carry toys. Infants are held in arms. They have dressed in their best clothes. It is a day to be seen, to celebrate, to escape the factory floor for a few hours of lake air and open sky. Boarding of the Eastland begins at approximately 6:30. Passengers cross the gangplank from the dock to the ship's main deck and disperse throughout the vessel. Some head immediately for the upper promenade deck, where they can watch the river and the city skyline as the ship departs. Some go below to the enclosed cabin decks, where there are tables and benches and a dining area. Some stay on the main deck near the gangway, waiting for friends and family members who have not yet arrived. A band is playing on the promenade deck. There is laughter, conversation, the sound of children running on steel decking, the sounds of a good morning. Captain Harry Pedersen is on the bridge. Pedersen is an experienced Great Lakes captain, a Norwegian-born mariner who has commanded passenger chapter. A constant adjustment. He has done this hundreds of times. By 7 o'clock, the ship is approaching capacity. The crowd on the dock is dense. More passengers are still boarding. Ericsson is working the ballast system steadily, counteracting the shifts in passenger weight as groups move from one side of the ship to the other. At approximately 7:10, the Eastland has roughly 2,500 passengers on board. She is at or very near her licensed capacity. The gangplank is still in place. A few stragglers are still crossing. On the dock, the second ship in line, the Theodore Roosevelt, is beginning to board its own passengers. At 7:16, the Eastland begins to list to port, toward the river, away from the dock. The lean is gradual at first. A degree, 2 degrees. Ericsson sees it on his inclinometer and orders the number 2 starboard ballast tank flooded to counteract. Water begins filling the tank on the right side of the ship. The lean slows but does not stop. At 7:18, the list has increased. Passengers on the main deck begin to notice. Some comment on it. A few laugh nervously. Others ignore it. Ships lean when people move around. It is normal. It will correct. The band continues to play. At 7:20, the list reaches approximately 10 degrees to port. This is not normal. Water begins to lap at the lower edge of the port side gangports, the small rectangular openings in the hull near the waterline. Several of these gangports are open for ventilation. River water begins to seep through. Ericsson is now fully alarmed. He has both port-side ballast tanks emptied and both starboard tanks filling. The pumps are running at full capacity. The ship does not respond adequately. The lean continues. At 7:21, a port-side gangport submerges completely. Water floods through the opening into the lower deck. The weight of the incoming water adds to the port-side load, accelerating the lean. This is the beginning of a feedback loop. The ship leans, water enters, the water makes the ship heavier on the leaning side, the ship leans further, more water enters. Once this cycle begins, it is nearly impossible to stop without external intervention. At 7:23, passengers on the upper decks feel the lean acutely. The deck is no longer level. People grab railings. Dishes slide off tables in the cabin below. A piano in the lower salon begins to roll across the floor, slowly at first, then with gathering momentum. It crashes into the port-side bulkhead. The sound carries through the ship. Some passengers begin to move to the starboard side, instinctively trying to counterbalance the lean. Others freeze. Others, particularly those below decks, do not yet understand what is happening. The lean could be the wake from a passing tugboat. It could be the engine starting. It could be nothing. At 7:24, the list exceeds 15 degrees. Chairs begin to slide. Children fall. On the promenade deck, passengers who are standing near the port railing find themselves looking almost directly down at the river surface, which is now alarmingly close. The laughter has stopped. At 7:25, the lean reaches approximately 20 degrees. The ship is now visibly, unmistakably tilting. Passengers on the dock can see it. People stop boarding. Some who were about to cross the gangplank step back. On the ship, a growing number of passengers begin to scramble toward the high side, toward starboard, toward the dock. but the gangplank is on the port side, the low side, and it is now angled steeply downward toward the water. Escape in that direction means climbing uphill on a wet steel surface. Ericsson has every valve open, every pump running. He is shouting to his crew. There is nothing more the ballast system can do. The system was designed to handle normal operational shifts, a few degrees of lean caused by passenger movement or wind. It was never designed to counteract a 20-degree list exacerbated by flooding through open gangports. At 7:26, the port side rail touches the water. The river begins to pour over the side and through every port side opening. The feedback loop is now catastrophic. Hundreds of tons of water are entering the ship. The weight is irrecoverable. At 7:27, passengers on the upper deck begin to fall. Those near the port rail are thrown into the river. Some jump deliberately. Some are pushed by the crowd sliding toward the low side. Some grab the starboard rail and hang on. Below decks, in the enclosed cabins and dining rooms, the situation is far worse. Passengers are tumbling across rooms that are rapidly rotating from horizontal to vertical. Furniture, luggage, pianos, potbelly stoves, everything that is not bolted down becomes a projectile, and water is pouring in through every opening on the port side, filling spaces that are no longer rooms but traps. At 7:28, the SS Eastland rolls completely onto her port side in the Chicago River. She does not sink. There is nowhere to sink to. The river at the Clark Street dock is approximately 20 feet deep. The Eastland draws roughly 14 feet. When she rolls 90 degrees, her port side settles into the river mud, and her starboard side rises above the surface like a steel cliff. The ship simply falls over, like a book sliding off a table, and comes to rest on her side, half submerged, still tied to the dock by her mooring lines. The entire sequence, from the first noticeable list to the final capsizing, has taken approximately 12 minutes. From the moment the lean became clearly dangerous, perhaps 5. 2,500 people are aboard. Those who are on the upper decks and on the starboard side are, relatively speaking, fortunate. They are thrown sideways but land on the starboard hull, which is now the top of the ship. They climb onto the exposed hull and stand there, wet and shaken, looking down at the water that now covers everything that was the port side of the vessel. Some are injured, many are in shock, but they are alive and above water. Those who are on the port side of the upper decks are thrown directly into the river. The lucky ones surface quickly and are pulled out by people on the dock or on the hull. The unlucky ones are trapped beneath the overhanging superstructure, pushed under by the wave of displaced water that the capsizing ship generates, or dragged down by the suction of the hull entering the river. Those who are below decks are in the worst position of all. They are inside a ship that has just rotated 90 degrees. The corridors are now vertical shafts. The floors are now walls. The doors that opened horizontally now open upward or downward, and many are jammed by the shift in the ship's structure. Water is flooding in from every port side opening. The spaces are filling. Some people find air pockets, sections of the hull where trapped air keeps the water at bay. Some of these people will be rescued hours later when welders cut through the steel above them. Some will not be found in time. The dock is 6 feet away. People standing on the wharf watch the ship go over. The distance between the hull and the dock is close enough to reach across, close enough to touch. Some people on the dock throw ropes immediately. Some throw wooden crates, barrels, anything that floats. Some jump into the river. The water is opaque with churned mud. They cannot see below the surface. They reach down and grab what they can. Sometimes it is a hand. Sometimes it is clothing. Sometimes it is a body that is no longer alive. The Chicago Fire Department is notified within minutes. Fireboats are dispatched. Police patrol boats arrive. Tugboats in the vicinity converge on the scene. Divers enter the water. Welders from nearby shipyards arrive with cutting torches and begin opening holes in the starboard hull, now the top of the ship, to reach people trapped inside. The rescue is chaotic and immediate and heroic and insufficient. Hundreds of people are pulled from the water alive. Hundreds more are not. By mid-morning, the nature of the operation changes. The calls from inside the hull grow quieter. The air pockets are shrinking. The water is rising. The divers, working in zero visibility in the muddy river water, begin to encounter bodies rather than survivors. By noon, it is no longer a rescue, it is a recovery. The bodies are brought to the surface through the holes cut in the hull. They are passed hand over hand along lines of rescuers and laid on the dock, then on the wharf beyond the dock, then on the cobblestone street, then in the backs of wagons and trucks that have been commandeered for transport. There are so many dead that the city needs a building large enough to serve as a temporary morgue. They choose the 2nd Regiment Armory on Washington Boulevard, approximately 4 blocks from the river. It is a large open structure, a drill hall with a high ceiling and a wooden floor. The bodies are brought there throughout the day and into the night. They are laid in rows on the armory floor. Sheets are placed over them. Tags are attached where identification is possible. Family members arrive to search for the missing. They walk the rows, lifting sheets, looking at faces. Blackwell has read the accounts of the armory. They are the most difficult part of the archive. Not because of the descriptions of death. Death in disaster archives is, grimly, routine, but because of the descriptions of identification. Mothers recognizing children by their shoes. Husbands identifying wives by a ring. Entire families found together, the parents' arms still wrapped around children who were not saved by the embrace. The final death toll is 844. This number has been refined over the years as records were cross-checked, but it has remained remarkably stable since the initial count. 844 people who boarded a ship on a Saturday morning for a company picnic and were dead before 8 o'clock. 22 entire families were erased. Parents and all their children together on the ship, together in the water, together in the armory. The Novotny family, parents and their 20-month-old son Willie. The Sladek family, all 5 members. The Arnstad family, Norwegian immigrants, the parents and their 3 children had been in the United States for less than 2 years. The youngest confirmed victim was Willie Novotny, 20 months old. The oldest was in her 70s. The majority were between 18 and 40, working-age adults, the backbone of Western Electric's factory floor. Czech immigrants, Polish immigrants, their American-born children, their elderly parents who had come along for the outing. The demographic profile of the dead was the demographic profile of industrial Chicago. Immigrant, working class, young. That is the event. The ship fell over. Now comes the reckoning, or what passed for one. The investigation began almost immediately. A federal grand jury was convened in Chicago within days of the disaster. The United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, a man named Charles Klein, led the prosecution. The coroner of Cook County, Peter Hoffman, conducted a parallel inquest. The Steamboat Inspection Service launched its own internal review. The state of Illinois opened an investigation. For a brief period in the summer and fall of 1915, the Eastland was the most investigated maritime disaster in American history. The first and most obvious question was overloading. Had the ship been carrying more passengers than her license allowed? The answer was no. The Eastland Certificate of Inspection, issued by the Steamboat Inspection Service, authorized her to carry 2,500 passengers. The best estimates place the actual number on board at between 2,400 and 2,500. She was at or just below her legal limit. The ship was not overloaded. She was carrying exactly the number of people the United States government had certified she could safely carry. This was not a comforting finding. It meant that the capacity limit itself was wrong. It meant that the federal inspection system had certified a maximum passenger load that the ship could not safely bear. The system had not been circumvented. The system had been followed, and following it had killed 844 people. The second question was operational error. Had the crew failed to properly manage the ship's stability during boarding? Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson testified at length. His testimony was detailed, technical, and consistent with the physical evidence. He had been actively managing the ballast system throughout the boarding process. He had monitored the ship's lean. He had flooded and emptied tanks as needed. When the list became dangerous, he had opened every valve available to him. The system was operational. It was simply overwhelmed. Captain Harry Pedersen testified that he had been on the bridge and had ordered the crew to manage the list. He stated that the Eastland had always leaned during loading and that the ballast system had always corrected it. On this morning, it did not. The third question was the ship's inherent design, and here the investigation entered politically dangerous territory, because acknowledging that the Eastland was structurally predisposed to capsizing meant acknowledging that every annual inspection, every certificate of safety, every stamp of approval from the Steamboat Inspection Service had been wrong. For 12 years. It meant the federal regulatory system had failed not once, not intermittently, but continuously and systematically. The inspectors who had certified the Eastland were questioned. Their answers were bureaucratic. The ship met the standards. The standards were the standards. If the standards were inadequate, that was a matter for the legislature, not for the individual inspector filling out the form. Blackwell has heard this defense before. In mine collapses, in bridge failures, in factory fires. The inspector did not create the standards. The inspector merely applied them. The standards were created by a committee. The committee was advised by industry. Industry had an interest in standards that were achievable, which is to say, standards that did not require expensive modifications to existing vessels. The circle is complete. Everyone did their job. No one did the right thing. And then there was the fourth question. The question nobody wanted to ask, because the answer implicated not a negligent company or a lazy inspector, but a federal law that the entire nation had supported. A law born from the ashes of the Titanic, a law that was supposed to make ships safer. The additional life-saving equipment. Herbert Sadler, a professor of naval architecture at the University of Michigan, was retained as an expert witness. Sadler was one of the most qualified naval architects in the country. His analysis of the Eastland was meticulous. Sadler calculated that the lifeboats, life rafts, davits, and associated equipment added to the Eastland in compliance with the La Follette Seamen's Act constituted approximately 14 tons of additional topside weight. He then calculated the effect of this weight on the ship's metacentric height, the measurement that determines how readily a vessel returns to an upright position after being tilted. His conclusion was unequivocal. The additional topside weight materially degraded the Eastland's already deficient stability margin. The life-saving equipment shifted the center of gravity upward by a measurable amount. In Sadler's assessment, the equipment did not merely contribute to the conditions that caused the capsizing, it was a significant factor. There it was, in technical language, supported by calculations, confirmed by one of the country's leading experts. The safety equipment mandated by a law written to prevent another Titanic had helped cause a disaster worse than the Titanic, measured by the speed of the killing. And here is where Blackwell encounters the wall that appears in so many of these cases. The wall between what the evidence shows and what the public and the government are willing to accept. The Follette Seamen's Act was popular. It was a triumph of progressive legislation. It was Senator Follette's signature achievement. It was the nation's answer to the Titanic. To publicly acknowledge that this law had contributed to the deaths of 844 people in a Chicago river would be to admit that good intentions, when applied without specificity, without attention to individual circumstances, without the simple question of whether this particular solution fits this particular problem, can be lethal. That admission was never made, not officially, not publicly, not in any form that entered the public record in a way that the average citizen would encounter. The criminal proceedings lasted 20 years. 20 years. The initial indictments were handed down against Captain Harry Pedersen, Chief Engineer Joseph Erickson, William Hull, the president of the St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company, and several officials of the Steamboat Inspection Service. The charges were criminal negligence and conspiracy. The case went to trial. It was appealed. It was sent back. New motions were filed. Witnesses died. Memories faded. The legal machinery ground forward at a pace that ensured the public's attention would be long gone before any verdict was reached. In 1935, 20 years after the disaster, Judge Clarence W. Sessions of the United States District Court for the Western District of Michigan dismissed all remaining charges. His ruling stated that the evidence did not establish criminal negligence on the part of any individual defendant. The ship was unstable, but no single person's action or inaction could be isolated as the criminal cause. No one went to prison. No one was meaningfully fined. The families of the dead received nothing from the criminal proceedings. Civil lawsuits fared marginally better, but only marginally. The legal battles over liability dragged on for years. The St. Joseph Chicago Steamship Company went bankrupt. The Steamboat Inspection Service, the federal agency that had certified the Eastland for 12 consecutive years, was shielded by sovereign immunity, the legal doctrine that says the government cannot be sued unless the government consents to be sued. The government did not consent. Some families received small settlements from insurance pools. Most received nothing. The dead were overwhelmingly working-class immigrants. They did not have attorneys on retainer. They did not have the resources to pursue litigation against a bankrupt company and an immune federal agency through a court system that measured its pace in decades. They buried their dead. They went back to work. The factory needed them on Monday. Blackwell wants to follow one more thread before leaving the courtroom. The thread of accountability, or rather, its absence. The Steamboat Inspection Service was reorganized in 1932, folded into the Bureau of Marine Inspection and Navigation. The reorganization was administrative. The inspectors who had certified the Eastland were not disciplined. They were not fired. They were not named in any official finding of fault. They retired with their pensions intact. The Follette Seamen's Act was not amended in response to the Eastland disaster. The specific provision requiring life-saving equipment for all passengers on all vessels was not revised to account for vessel stability. That particular fix, the recognition that adding topside weight to a marginally stable ship might be more dangerous than the risk it was meant to address, came later, quietly, in revised Coast Guard regulations that never mentioned the Eastland by name. The fix arrived decades after it mattered. It arrived in the form of a technical bulletin, not a headline. Senator Follette himself never publicly addressed the connection between his legislation and the Eastland disaster. He died in 1925, 10 years after the capsizing and 10 years before the criminal charges were dismissed. There is no record of him being asked about it in any surviving interview or correspondence. The question, it seems, was never put to him. Whether this was deference, oversight, or a collective decision not to tarnish a progressive legacy with an inconvenient catastrophe Blackwell cannot say. The archive is silent on the matter. Silence, in archives, is often the loudest sound. And the ship herself. This is the postscript that Blackwell finds most difficult to narrate with the composure that is expected. After the bodies were removed, after the river was dragged, after the last family had walked the rows of the 2nd Regiment Armory and identified, or failed to identify, their dead, the SS Eastland was righted. She was pumped out, towed to a shipyard, and surveyed for structural damage. The hull was intact. The engines were functional. The ship that had killed 844 people was, structurally, fine. She had not broken. She had not ruptured. She had simply fallen over. In 1917, the United States Navy purchased the Eastland. America had entered the First World War and needed vessels for training on the Great Lakes. The Navy renamed her the USS Wilmette, stripped her passenger fittings, modified her superstructure, and commissioned her as a gunboat and training vessel. She served in this capacity for the next 26 years, sailing the same waters where she had capsized, passing the same Chicago docks where 844 people had boarded her on a Saturday morning in July. The ship that had been deemed too unstable for civilian passenger service was given to the military. Blackwell will not comment on this. The fact is sufficient. The USS Wilmette was decommissioned in 1945 and scrapped in 1947. Her steel was melted down. Nothing of the original vessel survives. Now, the thread of memory. This is the thread that brought Blackwell to this story in the first place. Because the Eastland disaster is not merely a forgotten tragedy. It is a specifically, deliberately, structurally forgotten tragedy. And the reasons for its forgetting are as instructive as the disaster itself. The Titanic sank on April 15, 1912. The Eastland capsized on July 24, 1915, 3 years apart. The Titanic killed 1,503 people. The Eastland killed 844. By any measure, both are catastrophic losses of life. By the measure of speed, the rate at which people died per minute, the Eastland was worse. The Titanic took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The Eastland took less than 5. The Titanic is one of the most recognized disasters in human history. Books, documentaries, feature films, museums, traveling exhibitions, memorial societies, an Academy Award-winning motion picture that grossed over $2 billion worldwide. The word __, quote, _0, __, is a permanent fixture of the English language. A metaphor for hubris and catastrophe and the unsinkable thing that sinks. The Eastland has a plaque. The plaque was installed in 2003, 88 years after the disaster, on the north bank of the Chicago River near the site of the Clark Street dock. It is modest. It is not large. It does not face the street. It is positioned at a height and angle that most pedestrians walking along Wacker Drive would pass without noticing. Blackwell has stood at that plaque. Most of the people walking past did not stop. Most did not look. Most, almost certainly, did not know what had happened at that spot. There is no national memorial. There is no museum. There is no permanent exhibit in any major American history museum dedicated to the Eastland. There is no Hollywood film. There has been no Academy Award-winning motion picture. The Eastland does not appear in most American history textbooks. It is not part of the standard curriculum in any state. A poll conducted in Chicago, the city where it happened, found that fewer than 1 in 5 residents could identify the disaster by name. Why? The reasons are multiple, and Blackwell has spent considerable time sorting them. They fall, roughly, into 3 categories: setting, class, and narrative. Setting. The Titanic sank in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. The setting is inherently dramatic, vast, cold, dark. Remote. The ship was 4 days from land. The water was 2 miles deep. The nearest rescue was hours away. The scale of the ocean against the scale of the human body produces a natural sense of awe and terror. It is a setting that lends itself to literature, to cinema, to the imagination. The Eastland capsized in a river, a brown, shallow, industrial river in the middle of a city. The Docken was fined a meaningful amount. No one was held personally responsible for the deaths of 844 people. The families of the dead received nothing from the criminal courts. Civil lawsuits were filed, but the shipping company declared bankruptcy. The assets were insufficient to cover the claims. Some families received small payments from a relief fund organized by the city of Chicago and by private donors. The amounts were modest. They did not replace a breadwinner. They did not restore a family. The Steamboat Inspection Service was reorganized. It was not abolished. The inspectors who had certified the Eastland year after year were not disciplined. They were not fired. They were not named in any public accounting. They continued to inspect ships. The Follette Seamen's Act was not amended, not immediately. The provision requiring life-saving equipment for all passengers remained in force. The question of whether the additional topside weight posed a stability risk to smaller vessels was not formally addressed in the legislation for decades. When it was eventually addressed, it was done quietly, through revised technical regulations issued by the successor agencies to the Steamboat Inspection Service. The regulations did not mention the Eastland. The connection was not drawn in public. And then there is the matter of the ship herself. Because the Eastland did not end at the bottom of the Chicago River, she was righted, pumped out, towed to a shipyard, and repaired. In 1917, the United States Navy purchased her, renamed her the USS Wilmette, and converted her into a Naval Reserve training vessel. The same ship that had been deemed too dangerous for civilian passengers, the ship that had capsized at a dock and killed 844 people, was given to the military. She served on the Great Lakes as a training ship for the next 26 years, sailing the same waters where she had once carried picnickers to their deaths. In 1943, she was decommissioned. In 1947, she was sold for scrap. The hull that had trapped hundreds of men, women and children in dark, flooding compartments on a July morning was cut apart and melted down. There is no preserved section, no museum piece, no fragment behind glass with a placard explaining what happened. The Eastland vanished physically just as she was vanishing from memory. Blackwell needs to follow this thread, the thread of forgetting, because it is, in some ways, the cruelest part of the story. In the immediate aftermath, the disaster was national news. The Chicago Tribune devoted its front page to the story for days. Photographs of the capsized ship, of the bodies on the dock, of the rows of dead in the armory were published across the country. Newsreels played in theaters. President Wilson issued a statement. A national relief fund was established. Donations arrived from every state. For approximately 6 months, the Eastland disaster was among the most talked about events in America. Then it began to fade. Not gradually, the way most events recede, abruptly. Because on April 6, 1917, the United States entered the First World War. The nation's attention turned to conscription, to training camps, to casualty lists from the Western Front. The scale of death shifted by orders of magnitude. 844 dead in a river was a tragedy. 53,000 American dead in the Meuse-Argonne was a catastrophe that consumed every column inch of every newspaper for months. The Eastland could not compete. It was not that people forgot. It was that the frame of reference changed so radically that a peacetime disaster, however massive, could not hold its place in a consciousness now calibrated to the arithmetic of industrial warfare. After the war, The Eastland did not return to public memory. It stayed in the footnotes, and there are reasons beyond the war. The Titanic endured. The Titanic became a permanent fixture of Western culture. Books, films, songs, exhibitions. A James Cameron film that earned $2 billion. The Titanic is a household name in countries that have never seen an ocean. The Eastland is unknown in the city where it happened. Blackwell has considered why, and the reasons are uncomfortable. The Titanic sank in the North Atlantic, open ocean, icebergs, freezing water, a midnight sky full of stars. The setting is inherently dramatic, vast, romantic in the old sense of the word, a struggle between human ambition and the indifferent power of nature. The Eastland rolled over in a brown river in an industrial district on a grey morning. There is nothing romantic about the Chicago River in July. There is no vastness. There is no iceberg. There is a muddy channel between warehouses and a dock that smells of fish. The Titanic's passengers included some of the wealthiest and most famous people in the world. John Jacob Astor, Benjamin Guggenheim, Isidore and Ida Strauss. Their names were already known. Their deaths were personal losses to the readers of society pages. The Eastland's passengers were Czech machinists and Polish assemblers and Norwegian labourers and their wives and children. Factory workers, immigrants, people whose names had never appeared in a newspaper before and would appear only once in the list of the dead. Their disappearance from public memory was not accidental. It was structural. History remembers the deaths of the prominent more readily than the deaths of the obscure. A millionaire drowning in the Atlantic is a story. A machinist drowning in a river is a statistic. This is not a statement about what should be. It is a statement about what is. And then there is the cause. The Titanic was caused by an iceberg and by hubris and by too few lifeboats. These are clean narratives. There is a villain, the White Star Line, Captain Smith, the ice itself. There is a moral. Build enough lifeboats. The public can process it. It fits in a sentence. It fits on a poster. It fits in a film. The Eastland was caused by a safety law. The lifeboats required by that law, the very instruments of rescue and salvation, contributed to the capsizing. The moral is not clean. It does not fit in a sentence. It is a good law, written for the right reasons, applied without asking whether it fit the specific case, helped kill 844 people. That is not a story the public wants to hear. It is not a lesson anyone wants to teach. It does not have a villain. It has a system, and systems are harder to remember than villains. Systems do not photograph well. Systems do not have faces. So the Eastland faded. It became a question in local history quizzes, a paragraph in maritime disaster compendiums, a story that Chicagoans themselves, walking past the site every day, did not know. In 2003, 88 years after the disaster, a small memorial plaque was installed on the south bank of the Chicago River, near the site of the Clark Street dock. It took 88 years to put a plaque on a riverbank. The plaque is not large. It does not face the street. It is mounted on a railing at a height and angle that requires deliberate effort to read. Most people who pass it do not stop. Most people who stop do not know what it commemorates until they read it. There is no national memorial. There is no museum. There is no annual commemoration attended by public officials. There is no Hollywood film. There is a plaque that most Chicagoans have never seen, on a stretch of riverwalk that most Chicagoans walk past without pausing. The 844 names survive primarily in the records of the Cook County Coroner's Office and in the files maintained by the Eastland Disaster Historical Society, a small organization founded by descendants of the victims who refuse to let their families disappear entirely from the record. Some of the names survive in genealogical databases. Some survive in family stories, passed from grandparents to grandchildren. My great-aunt was on that ship. My grandfather's cousin never came home from the picnic. Most of the names survive nowhere at all. They were factory workers. They did not leave archives. They did not write memoirs. They existed in census records and payroll ledgers and union rolls, and when those documents aged past their administrative usefulness, many were discarded. The people who died on the Eastland are, in the most literal sense, being erased by time. Blackwell finds this unacceptable, not in the emotional sense, in the factual sense. 844 people dead, and the primary obstacle to their remembrance is that they were not rich enough or famous enough to have their deaths preserved by the machinery of culture. That is not a tragedy of memory. That is a feature of memory. Memory is not democratic. It never has been. It preserves what power and prominence and narrative convenience dictate, and it discards the rest. The Eastland passengers were the rest. Now, Blackwell wants to draw the lines together, because this story has many threads, and they all lead to the same point. The Eastland was a dangerous ship from the day she was built. Her design prioritized passenger capacity over stability. This was known. It was documented. It was reported. John Devereux York said so in 1904. Charles Eccliffe said so in 1906. Walter Steele said so in 1912. 3 men, across 8 years, told the people responsible for the safety of this vessel that the vessel was not safe. The Steamboat Inspection Service received their warnings and did nothing. Not because the warnings were unclear, not because the evidence was ambiguous, because doing something, reducing the passenger capacity, requiring structural modifications, pulling the ship from service, would have created conflict, cost money, and disrupted the routine operation of a bureaucracy that was designed to approve, not to question. The La Follette Seamen's Act, born from the Titanic, written to prevent another mass drowning at sea, was applied to a river steamer without any assessment of whether the specific requirements of the law were compatible with the specific characteristics of the ship. The law was a blanket. It covered everything. It fit nothing precisely, and in the case of the Eastland, it covered a coffin. The lifeboats were supposed to save them. The inspectors were supposed to protect them. The engineers who warned them were supposed to be heard. None of it worked. Not because the system failed, because the system functioned exactly as it was designed to function. It was designed to process paperwork. It was designed to issue certificates. It was designed to move from one inspection to the next without friction. It was not designed to stop. A warning is only as useful as the institution that receives it, and an institution that is designed to approve will approve even when the evidence says reject. This is not cynicism. This is the documented behavior of regulatory systems from 1852 to the present day. The Eastland is not an exception. The Eastland is the rule. 844 people, 20 feet of water, 6 feet from the sidewalk. The ship did not sink. It simply fell over. And the equipment that was supposed to keep them alive helped push it down. Every story Blackwell tells has a moment when the warning was clear and the response was silence. In this case, there were 4 warnings, 4 separate voices across 11 years saying the same thing in different words. The ship is dangerous. The ship will capsize. Reduce the capacity. Add permanent ballast. Do something. The something they got was more weight on top. Blackwell stood at the site on the Chicago River where the Clark Street dock once was. The dock is gone. The warehouses that lined the river are gone, replaced by glass towers and restaurants and a river walk where tourists take photographs of the skyline. The river itself is the same river, narrower now, cleaner, but the same channel of water that filled the lungs of 844 people on a Saturday morning in July. The plaque is there, small, modest, easy to miss. It names the ship. It names the date. It names the number. It does not name the names. There are too many. 844 names would not fit on a plaque. They would need a wall. The wall does not exist. The river is still there. The dock is still there, in a sense. The pilings remain underwater, visible to divers, invisible to everyone else. The names are fading. The ship was one kind of structure that could not bear the weight placed upon it. A hull too narrow, a superstructure too tall, a law too broad, an inspection system too compliant. But ships are not the only structures built this way. There are buildings designed with the same philosophy. Maximum capacity, minimum consideration for what happens when the design meets reality. Not factories, not ships, prisons. Next time, Blackwell opens the files on 2 penitentiaries built a century apart with identical philosophies. One in Philadelphia, 1829, one in Florence, Colorado, 1994. Both designed around the same idea. Total isolation reforms the criminal mind. Both produced the same result. The architecture of madness, built on purpose, twice, with 165 years to learn the lesson in between. The lesson was not learned. Blackwell has the blueprints.